So when people look back on Reagan's presidency, 1983 is a pretty key year. You can tell because I said pivotal year up there. But if you start 1983 and you just sort of follow the Reagan foreign policy, it's completely different than by 1984. So let's just look at this for a second. There are some things that happened in 1983 that really make Reagan appear as a hardliner. Like if you were just sitting there watching this, you would say not only does he have hardliners in his cabinet and hardliners in his foreign policy team, but he's also a hardliner. Because if you look at this, let's just roll through a couple of these things. January, the National Security Defense Directive of 1975, National Security Directive, whatever, 75. That NSDD thing, 75. It says that U.S. policy should be to roll back communism. Again, as opposed to contain, it is a roll back. So again, that is not a realist idea. That is very liberal, very hardliner. Well, I say hardliner, but neocon is what we mean here. In March, he gives that evil empire speech that we had there, which was in response to the proposed nuclear freeze. Don't freeze nuclear. You can't sort of, again, balance evil. And but once you call a empire evil, you can't just say now we're buddies again. I mean, that is a very big sort of like, they're not just different, they are, or a different power source, they are evil. Introduction in March is when we get SDI, that Star Wars thing. And again, what this is a nuclear missile defense system. It's supposed to shoot down nuclear missiles before they get there with lasers and other cool thing. Now, here's the deal. Did it work? No. It still doesn't work today. That's not the point. The point is if you're the Soviet Union, you have to believe it could work, and so we have to do the same thing. Can they afford to do that? The answer is no. In March, there's also the Soviet Union shoots down Korean Airlines 007. Now, it was probably an accident. Let's just go on that right now. But they shoot down the civilian airliner, and the United States gets a little pissed off about this. There's an aggressive reaction. Now, not in terms of like force or anything like that. It's just much more of a, you got to apologize, you got to do this, you got to do that, blah, blah, blah. Just sort of not letting the argument of it was an accident sort of play out. Now, there's one more thing. In November, there's this NATO military exercise. It's called Operation Able Archer. And it's just, again, a NATO exercise where the different countries, they send their troops together and they have a practice, and they try to see if there was going to be an attack, what would it look like, how do we sort of bounce against it, and they do little war games, things like that. Military exercise, they're a very common thing, but this one was done, again, not that this was any different, but this one was done with the idea that what would happen if the Soviets rolled into the Western Europe, and so they did this whole exercise in Western Europe. Now, here's the deal. If you're in the military, you look and you say, oh, this is what we're doing, here's the plan, blah, blah, blah. If you're the Soviets, you see this happening, and they're sending you, press releases saying essentially, yes, this is a military exercise, don't worry about it. But isn't that exactly what you would do if you were planning an attack? You would pretend it's a military exercise, and then when the Soviets think that you're just doing a military exercise, then you actually do the attack. And that's what the Soviets thought. They were super freaked out by this whole thing. And they thought, and the Soviets, well, anyways, from Reagan's point of view, it's just a NATO military exercise, no big deal. But we're definitely planning and aiming at this. Now, by November, now this is a little misleading because he doesn't come along, Gorbachev doesn't come along until 1985. But for now, by 1983, Reagan appears way more pragmatic. Here's the thing. A year later, or by the end of the year, he just appears way more pragmatic. Now, what happened? What's so different about this? We have a couple things. Number one, Secretary Shultz, Secretary of State, who is the pragmatist, is increasingly dominating foreign policy making. So, again, that's fine, but it begs the question, why did Reagan allow Shultz to dominate foreign policy making? And what Shultz does is he sets up a bunch of talks, he sets up a bunch of summits, which are going to culminate a couple of years later in 1985 when you have this guy named Gorbachev here and here. you're going to have these sort of summits where they get together and talk way more. At this point, Reagan's not sitting down with Soviets. By 1985, they actually is. The rhetoric is way toned down too. You're not going to hear evil empire anymore. You're not going to hear that kind of talk like, you guys suck, you need to go away, like that. The rhetoric is way more chill. Now the question becomes, why? So a guy, the National Security Advisor, Robert McFarlane, he's gonna write a book later on after the Reagan presidency, and he's gonna talk about this sort of, I guess you could say, conversion, where Reagan moves from being a hardliner, or at least the foreign policy of his administration moves from being a hardliner to pragmatic, from neocon to defensive realism. And so McFarlane's gonna make a couple arguments about this. And again, he's the insider here. This is still speculation, but it's not bad. So number one, there's gonna be this changing U.S. leadership. So that's gonna be the number one idea. U.S. Soviet leadership is going through a big change during this time. So in 1982, Brezhnev dies, and the new guy is a guy named Andropov. Andropov's in there from 1982 to February 1984, which is not that long. And while he is in charge, there's actually this deteriorating U.S.-Soviet relations, because he was the former KGB head, which again is, if you don't know this is like Soviet CIA. So, Putin is the same thing, was a former KGB guy. But essentially, so during 1983, that year we're talking about here, you have this guy named Andropov in there who is just a little bit more on edge. And if you're getting briefings, if you're Reagan getting briefings about this, you're a little bit more nervous about this. Problem is, from August 1983 to his death in February 1984, he's sick in the hospital. So there is, especially early in 1983, there's good reason to sort of be on edge about what Soviets might do, could do, because you have this former KGB head now in charge of stuff. From August 1983, he's clearly in the hospital. He's dying of, I think it was cancer, I think is what it was. He's pretty sick and not really clear who's in charge, which doesn't necessarily make you feel better about things, but definitely things are a little bit different. The guy who comes after Andropov is a guy named Chernenko, and he's president, or I don't know about president, he's in charge of the Soviet Union from 1984 to March of 1985. But while he's in power, he's also really sick during this time. So there's a lot of questions sort of raised about what this, and the argument that McFarlane says is that Reagan may have adjusted his approach accordingly. In fact, you can make a pretty good argument that in the early 1983, when Andropov is in charge, scary. Late 1983, a little more cautious. All right, so that's argument number one about that McFarlane makes about this Reagan's conversion from hardliner to pragmatist. The second argument, love that picture, by the way, of Reagan and the Queen there, is that the UK has a new intelligence source within the Soviet Union, a guy named Gordievsky, who's way up at the top. Not the leader, not one of the main ministers, but definitely has a place around a lot of the Soviet tables. And he is a spy who is reporting to the UK. If you've ever, by the way, Tom Clancy wrote this book, The Cardinal of the Kremlin. It was kind of based on this. Is that there's this really key source inside the Soviet Union, blah, blah, blah. All right, so here's the deal. What Gordievsky was able to do, he didn't actually give top secret stuff or anything like that to the UK or anything. He wasn't that sort of a spy. What he was he was basically telling the UK, who then informed the United States, what's happening inside the Soviet Union so that the United States and the UK could better understand and not make stupid mistakes. So here's what he reports. The Kremlin believed that the Korean Airlines shoot down was actually a CIA plot. And again, it's not just like this is a theory or a conspiracy. Like the people who are at the table, the Kremlin is sort of the leadership of the Soviet Union. The people who are at the table in the Soviet Union believed that the CIA had hatched this whole thing, that they had caused this airliner to fly over Soviet airspace, so the Soviets would shoot it down and they'd look dumb. They really believe that. Again, if you are the United States, you're thinking, why'd you guys shoot this down? They didn't the United States didn't understand. The Kremlin saw this very differently. Kremlin also thought that Able Archer masked a first U.S. strike. So here's the deal. So as you're getting this information, here's Reagan sitting in the White House, and he's hearing this. Like, this is what you think is going on, but here's what the Kremlin thinks is going on. And this showed Reagan how his actions were being seen, which means that every time the U.S. was doing something aggressive, the Kremlin was reading this as super aggressive. Every time the United States did anything, the Soviet Union was interpreting it in the worst way possible. So now if you're Reagan, that changes your mind about things. Are you really sending the signals you're trying to send? Or are you actually, by just doing just things like saying evil empire, this, are you actually making things way worse than they are? So the more that Reagan was able to understand that the Kremlin was paranoid, the more he understood that the U.S. actions could be misperceived and could lead to war. And the result, again, from McFarlane is Reagan says we better tone things down a little bit. Not because we're so much wrong, but just because they can be misperceived so easily. And Reagan has good information now from Gordievsky that essentially they will be misperceived. So he turns to Schultz. Now here's the thing. What's the story? Nobody really knows. I mean, obviously, what's going on in Reagan's head, how involved Reagan actually was. There's all these Saturday Night Live skits about how Reagan was not really involved. He was just sort of, that he was involved, but not really involved. It's just a whole thing. Nobody really knows what the story is. This is a pretty good argument of what's going on, but nobody really knows. What we do know is 1983, super hardline, from late 1983, about November, December, after Able Archer, until the end of the Reagan presidency, man, he could not be more defensive realist. The U.S. foreign policy could not be more defensive realist. All right, well, we'll come back to that here in a second.